The wind howled like a banshee across the mountain peaks as Virginia Reyes pressed her back against the rough-hewn cabin door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the single frost-covered window, she could see the dark silhouettes moving between the pine trees, their voices carrying on the bitter air like the growls of hungry wolves. Samuel Morgan stood before her, his massive frame blocking the doorway, a rifle cradled in his weathered hands with the easy familiarity of a man who had faced death more times than he cared to count. "They won't take you," he said, his voice low and steady as granite, eyes never leaving the approaching figures. "Not while I draw a breath." Virginia felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she watched this man, this supposedly cruel mountain hermit whom the townspeople whispered about in fearful tones, prepare to risk everything for her. Just 3 months ago, she would never have imagined standing here in this remote cabin perched on the edge of the world, feeling safer than she had in years. 3 months ago, she had been desperate enough to take the job no woman dared, working for the man they called Heartless. Now, as the shadows closed in around them, she understood with crystalline clarity that these had been the brightest days of her life. But the story of how Virginia Reyes came to find sanctuary in the arms of danger begins much earlier in the dusty streets of Cedar Falls, where desperation wore a woman's face and hope seemed as distant as the snow-capped peaks that loomed over the valley like silent sentinels watching over the struggles of mere mortals below. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden sidewalks as Virginia clutched her worn leather satchel to her chest, her knuckles white with the effort of holding herself together. The rejection still rang in her ears from the general store, the third establishment that week to turn her away with barely concealed disgust. "We don't hire women of your kind," the shopkeeper had said, his eyes cold as winter stones. "Find yourself a husband, or find yourself gone from this town." Virginia's stomach cramped with hunger, a constant companion these past weeks since she had fled her stepfather's house in the dead of night, leaving behind everything she had ever known except the clothes on her back and the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow she could build a life of her own. The coins in her purse had dwindled to mere copper pennies, not enough for another night at the boarding house. Certainly not enough for the stagecoach ticket that might carry her to a larger town where a woman alone might find work without the weight of small-town judgment crushing her spirit. She paused outside Murphy's Saloon, where a handwritten notice fluttered against the weathered wood like a trapped bird. The ink was faded, the paper curled at the edges, as if it had been hanging there for weeks without a single soul brave enough or foolish enough to respond. Virginia squinted at the carefully formed letters, her heart beginning to race as she read the words that would change the course of her life forever. "Housekeeper wanted. Mountain cabin. $30 monthly plus room and board. Inquire S. Morgan, North Trail, Pine Ridge." Below the terse announcement, someone had scrawled in different handwriting, "Don't go, girl. He's killed 3 housekeepers already." Virginia stared at the notice until the letters blurred before her eyes. $30 monthly was more money than she had ever seen in one place. Enough to buy her freedom, enough to start over somewhere new where nobody knew her story or her shame. But the warning scratch below made her blood run cold. She had heard the whispers about Samuel Morgan, the mountain man who lived alone in the wilderness, like some savage beast, emerging only to trade furs and buy supplies before disappearing back into the forest. They said he was cruel, that he had driven away every woman who had tried to work for him, that his cabin was haunted by the ghosts of those who had crossed him. A hand fell on her shoulder, making her jump. She turned to find Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, her face pinched with disapproval beneath her feathered hat. "Virginia Reyes, what are you doing loitering outside a saloon like some common trollop? Have you no shame left at all?" The words hit Virginia like physical blows, each syllable designed to cut deep and leave scars. She had endured weeks of such treatment, the constant reminder that in the eyes of Cedar Falls, she was nothing more than damaged goods, a woman who had fled her family home rather than submit to an arranged marriage with a man 3 times her age, who had already buried 2 wives under suspicious circumstances. "I'm looking for work, Mrs. Henderson," Virginia replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Honest work." Mrs. Henderson's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Honest work? You should have thought of that before you brought scandal to your family's name. No decent establishment in this town will hire you. And, well, they shouldn't. You've made your bed, girl. Now lie in it. As the woman swept away in a rustle of silk and self-righteousness, Virginia felt something harden inside her chest, a core of steel that she had never known existed. She looked again at the notice, at the warning scrawled below, and made a decision that would have terrified her just moments before. If the town considered her already damned, then what did she have to lose by taking a chance on the devil himself? The trail to Pine Ridge was treacherous, winding through dense forest where the trees grew so thick that even midday felt like twilight. Virginia had purchased a sturdy pair of boots with her last coins and borrowed a heavy coat from the boarding house keeper's daughter, a girl who had shown her unexpected kindness in those final hours before she left civilization behind. The pack on her back contained everything she owned: 2 worn dresses, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a small knife that she prayed she would never need to use. As she climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thin and sharp, each breath burning her lungs like ice and fire combined. The path was barely visible in places, marked only by occasional blazes cut into the bark of ancient pines. More than once, she lost the trail entirely and had to backtrack, her heart pounding with the fear that she would be caught by darkness in this wilderness where wolves and bears ruled the night. The cabin appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, perched on a narrow ledge that overlooked a valley so deep it seemed to fall away into the very heart of the earth. It was larger than she had expected, built from massive logs that spoke of a man who understood the fury of mountain winters, with a stone chimney that rose like a monument to human stubbornness against the indifferent sky. Smoke curled from that chimney now, a sign of life in this desolate place that should have been comforting but somehow made her more nervous. Virginia stood at the edge of the clearing for long minutes, gathering her courage like a cloak around her shoulders. The stories she had heard in town painted Samuel Morgan as a monster, but the cabin before her spoke of careful craftsmanship and attention to detail. The windows were clean, the porch swept, the woodpile stacked with mathematical precision. Whatever else he might be, the man who lived here was not the savage beast of local legend. She was still standing there, frozen between fear and determination, when the door opened and he emerged. Samuel Morgan was indeed a giant of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that touched his collar and a beard that spoke of months in the wilderness. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale blue like winter sky, holding an intelligence and wariness that surprised her. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, but there was no menace in his stance, only a careful stillness that suggested a man accustomed to being alone. "You lost?" His voice was deep, rough with disuse, but not unkind. Virginia found her own voice with effort. "I'm here about the position. The housekeeper job." Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to interpret. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her travel-worn appearance, the pack on her shoulders, the determined set of her jaw, despite the fear she knew must be written clearly in her eyes. "You read the whole notice?" he asked finally. "Yes, sir." "Including what someone wrote below it?" Virginia lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "Yes, sir. I read that too." Samuel Morgan was quiet for so long that she began to think he would simply turn and walk back inside, leaving her standing in the clearing like some unwanted ghost. But finally, he stepped aside and gestured toward the open door. "Come in then. We'll talk." The interior of the cabin was a revelation that shattered every preconception Virginia had carried with her up the mountain trail. The main room was spacious and clean, with a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall and cast dancing shadows across furniture that, while simple, was clearly handcrafted with skill and care. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes that spoke of education and refinement, far removed from the savage hermit of local legend. The wooden floors were swept clean, the windows sparkling, the entire space organized with the precision of a man who understood that in the wilderness, chaos could mean death. Samuel gestured toward a chair near the fire, and Virginia sank into it gratefully, her legs suddenly weak from the long climb and the tension of the encounter. He moved to the kitchen area, which was separated from the main room only by a long wooden counter, and she could hear him preparing something. The familiar sounds of domesticity that seemed impossibly normal in this place that existed at the edge of the world. He returned with 2 cups of coffee, the rich aroma making her mouth water. She accepted the cup with hands that trembled slightly, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic as if it were a lifeline. The coffee was strong and hot, better than anything she had tasted in the boarding house, and she had to resist the urge to drain it in desperate gulps. "When did you last eat?" Samuel asked, settling into the chair across from her with his own cup. The question caught her off guard, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Yesterday morning," she admitted, seeing no point in lying to this man who seemed to see through pretense as easily as looking through clear glass. He nodded as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected, then rose and moved back to the kitchen. Virginia heard the sounds of cooking, the sizzle of bacon in a pan, the crack of eggs, the rustle of bread being sliced. Her stomach cramped with hunger so intense it was almost painful, but she forced herself to sit still, to maintain what dignity she had left. When he returned, it was with a plate piled high with food, thick slices of bacon, eggs cooked perfectly, bread still warm from the oven, and butter that was clearly fresh churned. He set it before her without ceremony, along with a fork and knife, then returned to his chair to watch her with those pale blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Virginia stared at the plate, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of the gesture. In town, she had been treated as a pariah, a woman whose very presence was contaminating. Here, this man who was supposed to be a monster had fed her without question, without judgment, without demanding anything in return. "Eat," he said simply. "We can talk after." She ate slowly at first, trying to maintain some semblance of manners, but hunger soon overcame propriety, and she found herself devouring the meal with an intensity that would have embarrassed her under other circumstances. Samuel said nothing, simply sipped his coffee and watched the fire, giving her the privacy to eat without feeling like a spectacle. When she finally set down her fork, her stomach full for the first time in weeks, she found him studying her again with that unreadable expression. "Why did you come here?" he asked. The question was simple, but Virginia sensed that her answer would determine everything that followed. She could lie, could present herself as simply a woman seeking honest work, but something in his manner suggested that he would see through any deception as easily as he had recognized her hunger. "Because I had nowhere else to go," she said finally. "Because I need the work, and because everyone in town has made it clear that I'm not welcome anywhere else." "What did you do to earn such treatment?" Virginia felt her cheeks burn again, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I refused to marry the man my stepfather chose for me. I left in the night rather than submit to a union that would have been little better than slavery." Samuel nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he had suspected. "And they blame you for that choice. They blame me for bringing shame to my family, for being willful and disobedient, for thinking I had the right to choose my own path." The words came out more bitter than she had intended, years of suppressed anger and hurt coloring her voice. "Do you?" he asked quietly. "Think you have that right?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Virginia realized that her answer would reveal more about her character than any list of qualifications or references ever could. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I do. I believe that every person, man or woman, has the right to determine their own fate, to choose their own path, even if that path leads to hardship or uncertainty. I would rather face whatever dangers await me here than live a life of comfortable captivity." Something shifted in Samuel's expression, a subtle softening around his eyes that transformed his entire face. For the first time since she had arrived, Virginia saw not the fearsome mountain man of legend, but simply a man who understood what it meant to choose solitude over submission, freedom over safety. "The work is hard," he said finally. "Cleaning, cooking, mending, tending the garden when spring comes. The winters are brutal, and we may go weeks without seeing another soul. The nearest neighbor is a day's ride away, and the town might as well be on the other side of the world. If you're looking for society or entertainment, you won't find it here." "I'm not looking for entertainment," Virginia replied. I'm looking for a chance to prove that I can stand on my own, that I can work and earn my keep without depending on anyone else's charity or goodwill." Samuel studied her for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "The stories they tell about me in town, they're not entirely false. I don't suffer fools gladly, and I have little patience for those who can't pull their own weight. I've had 3 housekeepers before you, and each one left within a month, claiming I was impossible to work for." "What made them leave?" Virginia asked, though she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. "Fear, mostly. Fear of the isolation, fear of the work, fear of me." His voice was matter-of-fact, without self-pity or defensiveness. "I don't coddle people, and I don't pretend to be something I'm not. If you stay, you'll earn every dollar I pay you, and you'll do it without complaint, or you'll find yourself walking back down that mountain trail." Virginia felt a strange sense of relief at his bluntness. After weeks of whispered judgments and veiled insults, his directness was almost refreshing. "I understand, Mr. Morgan. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'm not looking for coddling. I just want a fair chance to prove myself." Samuel rose from his chair and moved to one of the windows, gazing out at the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear like scattered diamonds against black velvet. "There's a storm coming," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who had learned to read the mountain's moods. "You'll stay the night, and we'll see how you feel about this arrangement in the morning." He showed her to a small room at the back of the cabin, simply furnished but scrupulously clean, with a narrow bed covered in quilts that looked handmade, and a small window that offered a view of the forest, stretching away into darkness. There was a wash basin and pitcher, towels that smelled of soap and mountain air, and a lamp that cast a warm circle of light against the gathering gloom. "Breakfast is at dawn," Samuel said from the doorway. "If you're still here when I wake up, I'll assume you've decided to stay. If not, I'll understand." After he left, Virginia sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened in the space of a few hours. She had climbed a mountain in desperation, expecting to find either salvation or destruction, and instead had found something far more complex. A man who defied every expectation, a place that felt more like home than anywhere she had lived in years. And the first real opportunity she had been offered to build a life on her own terms. The storm Samuel had predicted arrived with a vengeance sometime after midnight. Wind howling around the cabin like a living thing seeking entry. Rain drumming against the windows with the intensity of gunfire. Virginia lay in the narrow bed, listening to the fury of the elements and marveling at how safe she felt within these sturdy log walls. She had spent the last month sleeping in boarding house rooms where every creak of the floorboards might signal danger, where she never knew if the lock on her door would hold against men who saw her as prey rather than person. Here in the cabin of a man the town considered dangerous, she felt protected in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. She woke before dawn to the sound of movement in the main room, the soft sounds of someone building up the fire and preparing breakfast. Virginia dressed quickly in the dim pre-dawn light, smoothing her hair as best she could and steeling herself for whatever test this day might bring. When she emerged from her room, she found Samuel already at work in the kitchen, moving with the efficient economy of motion that spoke of years of solitary living. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He glanced up from the pan where bacon was already sizzling. "Morning. Sleep well?" "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, then added, "The storm was impressive." "That was just a spring shower," Samuel replied with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Wait until you see a real mountain storm." Virginia moved to the window and looked out at a world transformed by the night's rain. The forest seemed to glow with an inner light, every leaf and needle washed clean and sparkling with droplets that caught the early morning sun like tiny prisms. The air that drifted through the slightly open window was so clean and sweet it almost made her dizzy after months of breathing the dust and smoke of town air. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "It can be," Samuel agreed. "It can also be deadly. Beauty and danger go hand in hand up here. It's something you learn to respect, or it kills you." He set a plate before her, another generous helping of food that made her realize how much her body had been craving proper nourishment. As she ate, he outlined what her duties would be: maintaining the cleanliness of the cabin, preparing meals, mending clothes and linens, tending the vegetable garden that would need planting soon, preserving food for the long winter months ahead. The list was extensive, but nothing she had not expected. "I should tell you," he said as she finished eating, "that I'm not always here. Sometimes I'm gone for days at a time, hunting or trapping or trading with a few neighbors scattered through these mountains. You'll be alone, and you'll need to be able to take care of yourself." The thought of being alone in this remote place might have terrified her weeks ago, but now Virginia found it oddly appealing. Solitude had become a luxury she had learned to treasure, and the idea of days when she could work at her own pace without judgment or interference seemed like a gift rather than a burden. "I can handle that," she said. Samuel studied her face as if trying to read her sincerity, then nodded. "We'll start with a month's trial. If either of us decides this isn't working, you'll get fair warning and help getting back to town." "Fair enough." "More than fair," Virginia replied, extending her hand to seal the agreement. His hand was calloused and strong, the grip firm but not punishing, and she felt a strange sense of rightness in the simple gesture. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Virginia found deeply satisfying. She woke with the sun, prepared breakfast for them both, then set about the day's tasks while Samuel attended to his own work around the property. He was, she discovered, far more than the simple mountain man she had expected. The books that lined his shelves were not mere decoration. He read voraciously, everything from philosophy to poetry to technical manuals on everything from engineering to medicine. His conversation, when he chose to engage in it, revealed a sharp intelligence and a breadth of knowledge that would have impressed the most learned men in town. More surprising still was his gentleness. Despite his intimidating size and the stories that surrounded him, Samuel Morgan was invariably courteous, never raising his voice or showing impatience with her questions or mistakes. When she burned the first batch of bread she attempted, he simply helped her analyze what had gone wrong and encouraged her to try again. When she struggled with the heavy cast iron pots, he quietly rearranged the kitchen to make her work easier without making her feel inadequate. As the days stretched into weeks, Virginia began to understand why the previous housekeepers had fled. It was not cruelty that had driven them away, but the profound solitude of mountain life, the way days could pass without seeing another human soul, the constant awareness that they were utterly dependent on their own resources and skills for survival. For someone accustomed to the social fabric of town life, the isolation would be maddening. But for Virginia, who had spent months feeling like an outcast in her own community, the solitude was healing. She found herself looking forward to the quiet evenings when she and Samuel would sit by the fire, he with one of his books, and she with mending or some other handwork. Sometimes they would talk, conversations that ranged from practical matters to deeper subjects that revealed layers of thought and feeling she had never expected to find in this remote place. Other times they would sit in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the eternal whisper of wind through the pines. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Samuel first spoke of his past, the words coming slowly as if drawn from some deep well of memory he rarely allowed himself to visit. "I came here 15 years ago," he said, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "After the war? After I lost everything that mattered to me." Virginia set down her sewing, sensing that this was not a story he told lightly. "What did you lose?" "My wife, my daughter. They died of fever while I was away fighting, and I came home to find them already buried." His voice was steady, but she could hear the old pain beneath the words like a river running deep underground. The house felt like a tomb, and the town felt like a prison. "I couldn't breathe there anymore. Couldn't stand the sympathy and the whispered conversations and the constant reminders of what I'd lost. So I came here, to a place where the only ghosts are the ones I choose to carry with me." Virginia felt tears prick her eyes at the simple, devastating honesty of his words. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I can't imagine such loss." Samuel looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Can't you? Seems to me you've lost plenty yourself. Family, home, the life you thought you'd have. Maybe not through death, but loss is loss." The observation was so perceptive, so unexpectedly understanding, that Virginia felt something shift inside her chest, a wall she had built around her heart beginning to crack. "It's not the same thing," she protested weakly. "No," he agreed, "but it's still real. Still something that changes you, makes you into someone different than you were before. The question is whether you let it make you bitter or whether you use it to build something new." They sat in silence for a while after that, each lost in their own thoughts. But it was a different kind of silence than before, charged with a new understanding that seemed to bridge the space between them. Virginia found herself studying Samuel's profile in the firelight, seeing not the fearsome mountain man of legend, but a wounded soul who had found a way to build a life from the wreckage of his dreams. As spring progressed into early summer, Virginia discovered aspects of mountain life that no one in town had ever mentioned in their fearful whispers. There was a garden behind the cabin, carefully planned and tended, that produced vegetables of a quality and variety that would have been the envy of any farmer in the valley. Samuel knew which wild plants were edible and which were medicinal, could track game through forests that looked trackless to her untrained eyes, could predict weather changes days in advance by reading signs in the sky and wind that she was only beginning to learn to recognize. He began teaching her these skills, not through formal lessons, but through patient demonstration and gentle correction when she made mistakes. He showed her how to preserve meat and vegetables for the long winter ahead, how to read the forest for signs of danger or opportunity, how to maintain the various tools and equipment that kept them comfortable and safe in their remote home. With each new skill she mastered, Virginia felt herself growing stronger, more confident, more capable of standing on her own feet. But it was not just practical skills that she was learning. Living in such close proximity to Samuel, sharing meals and conversations and the thousand small intimacies of daily life, she began to see him as he truly was beneath the protective armor of solitude he had built around himself. He was kind without being soft, strong without being cruel, intelligent without being condescending. He treated her as an equal partner in their shared enterprise, rather than as a servant or subordinate, asking her opinion on matters large and small and actually listening to her answers. More surprising still was the way he seemed to see her, not as the damaged goods that the town had labeled her, but as a woman of worth and capability. When she successfully completed a difficult task, she could see genuine pride in his eyes. When she struggled with something new, he offered help without making her feel inadequate. Slowly, carefully, he was helping her rebuild the confidence that months of rejection and judgment had nearly destroyed. The transformation was not just internal. The constant physical work, the clean mountain air, the nutritious food, and the absence of stress were changing her body as well as her spirit. Her hands, once soft and pale, grew strong and capable. Her step became surer, her posture straighter. She began to sleep deeply and dreamlessly, waking each morning refreshed and eager for the day's challenges. It was on a morning in late June, as she stood in the garden picking vegetables for their breakfast, that Virginia realized with startling clarity that she was happy. Not just content or satisfied, but genuinely deeply happy in a way she had never been before. The realization stopped her cold, a handful of fresh peas forgotten in her palm as she tried to process this unexpected gift. The sound of hoofbeats on the trail broke through her reverie, and Virginia looked up to see a rider approaching through the trees. Her first instinct was alarm. In all her weeks at the cabin, they had not had a single visitor, and she had grown accustomed to thinking of their mountain retreat as existing outside the normal flow of human contact. But as the rider drew closer, she recognized the uniform of a territorial marshal, and her alarm deepened into something approaching panic. Samuel emerged from the cabin at the sound of the approaching horse, and Virginia saw his entire demeanor change. The relaxed openness she had grown accustomed to, replaced by the wary stillness of a predator assessing a potential threat. He moved to stand between her and the approaching rider, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of protection that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The marshal was a lean, weathered man, with cold eyes and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. He dismounted with the stiff movements of someone who had spent too many hours in the saddle, his hand never straying far from the gun at his hip. "Samuel Morgan?" he asked. though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "That's right," Samuel replied, his voice carefully neutral. "What brings you up the mountain, Marshal?" "Looking for someone. A woman named Virginia Reyes. Got word she might be up this way." Virginia felt the blood drain from her face, but Samuel's expression didn't change. "What's your business with her?" The marshal's eyes flicked to Virginia, who was still standing frozen in the garden, then back to Samuel. "Her stepfather's filed a complaint. Says she stole money from him when she ran off. Says she's wanted for theft." The words hit Virginia like physical blows, each syllable a fresh betrayal. She had taken nothing when she fled her stepfather's house, except the clothes on her back and a few personal belongings that had belonged to her mother. But she knew how the law worked, how a man's word carried weight that a woman's never could, especially a woman who had already marked herself as rebellious and ungovernable. "That's a lie," she said, finding her voice at last. "I took nothing that wasn't rightfully mine." The marshal shrugged as if her protests were irrelevant. "That's for a judge to decide. I'm here to bring you back to face the charges." Samuel stepped forward, his movement fluid and dangerous despite its apparent casualness. "You have a warrant?" "Don't need one for a family matter. Her stepfather has legal authority over her until she's married or reaches her majority." "She's working for me," Samuel said quietly, "under a legal contract. That makes her my responsibility while she's on my property." Virginia stared at him in amazement. There had been no written contract between them, nothing but a handshake agreement that either of them could have terminated at any time. But Samuel was presenting their arrangement as something formal and binding, using his reputation and presence to shield her from the marshal's authority. The marshal's eyes narrowed. "You willing to stand against the law for a woman you barely know?" "I'm willing to stand against injustice," Samuel replied, and there was something in his voice that made the marshal take an involuntary step backward. "This woman has done nothing wrong except refuse to be sold like livestock to a man she didn't choose. If that's a crime, then the law needs changing." For a long moment, the two men faced each other in silence, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Virginia found herself holding her breath, torn between gratitude for Samuel's protection and fear that her presence would bring violence to this peaceful place. Finally, the marshal spoke. "I could come back with more men." "You could try," Samuel agreed, his tone conversational, but his meaning unmistakable. "Course, by the time you made it back up here, we might be long gone. These mountains are big, Marshal, and I know them better than any man alive. You want to spend the next few months chasing shadows through wilderness that's killed better men than you?" The marshal's jaw worked as if he were chewing something bitter. Virginia could see him weighing his options, calculating the cost of pursuing this matter against the likely rewards. Finally, he spat in the dust and remounted his horse. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Samuel replied with quiet certainty. "Tell her stepfather that Virginia Reyes is under my protection now. If he wants to pursue this matter further, he can take it up with me directly." The marshal wheeled his horse around and rode back down the trail without another word, leaving Virginia and Samuel standing in the sudden silence like survivors of a storm. Virginia felt her knees go weak, and she sank down onto the garden bench, her hands shaking with reaction. Samuel moved to her side, his large hand gentle on her shoulder. "You all right?" Virginia looked up at him, this man who had just risked everything to protect her, and felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do that for me?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his pale blue eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because you deserve better than what they were offering you," he said finally. "Because you've got courage and strength and dignity, and those things shouldn't be crushed just because you had the misfortune to be born a woman in a world run by small-minded men." The simple honesty of his words broke something open inside Virginia's chest, and she found herself crying in earnest now, not from fear or sadness, but from a relief so profound it felt like being reborn. For the first time in her life, someone saw her true worth. Someone was willing to stand up for her, right to choose her own path. Samuel knelt beside the bench, his weathered hands covering hers with surprising gentleness. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "That marshal will be back, probably with more men and maybe a federal warrant. We need to be ready for that possibility." Virginia wiped her eyes and tried to focus on his words, despite the emotional turmoil churning inside her. What do you mean? I mean, we need to make your position here legal and unassailable. The only way to do that is to make you my wife. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything Virginia thought she understood about her situation. She stared at Samuel, searching his face for some sign that this was a cruel joke or a moment of madness brought on by the confrontation with the marshal. You can't be serious, she whispered. I'm completely serious, Samuel replied. It's the only way to protect you from your stepfather's legal claims. As my wife, you'd be under my protection by law, not just by my word. No marshal could take you away without my consent. Virginia felt her world tilting on its axis. But you don't love me. I don't love you. We barely know each other. Something flickered across Samuel's face, an expression too complex and fleeting for her to interpret. Love is a luxury, Virginia. Right now, you need protection more than romance. I'm offering you safety, security, and the freedom to build whatever kind of life you want within the bounds of this arrangement. It's more than most marriages offer. The brutal practicality of his proposal should have offended her, should have made her feel like he was treating her as a commodity to be acquired rather than a person to be cherished. Instead, she found herself considering his words with a clarity that surprised her. He was right that love was a luxury she could not afford, right that her immediate need was for legal protection from forces that would destroy her if given the chance. But more than that, she realized that the life he was offering, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than romantic passion, might actually be preferable to the fairy tale of love she had once dreamed of. What would you expect from such a marriage? She asked carefully. Samuel's answer came without hesitation, as if he had already thought through every aspect of the arrangement. Nothing more than what we have now. You'd continue as my housekeeper and partner in running this place. I'd provide for you and protect you as any husband should. Beyond that, we'd work out the details as we went along. And if someday you wanted a real wife, someone you actually loved, then we'd discuss it like reasonable adults and figure out what was best for both of us, Samuel replied. But I'm not holding my breath for that possibility. I've had my chance at love, and I'm not looking for another. What I'm offering you is something different, a partnership between equals, a chance to build something worthwhile together without all the messy complications of romance getting in the way. Virginia found herself oddly reassured by his bluntness. There would be no false promises between them, no pretense of emotions that didn't exist, no crushing disappointment when reality failed to live up to romantic ideals. What he was offering was honest, practical, and infinitely more secure than anything else available to her. How would we arrange it? She asked, and realized that her question was as good as an acceptance. There's a circuit preacher who comes through these parts once a month. He's due next week. We could have him perform the ceremony, file the papers with the territorial government, and make it all legal and proper. The speed with which he had worked out the logistics suggested that Samuel had been thinking about this possibility for longer than just the few minutes since the marshal's departure. Virginia wondered when the idea had first occurred to him, whether it had been a gradual realization or a sudden inspiration born of crisis. All right, she said finally. If you're certain this is what you want, then yes, I'll marry you. Samuel's relief was visible, though he tried to hide it behind his usual stoic expression. Good. That's settled one then. But even as Virginia agreed to the arrangement, she felt a strange sense of loss, as if she were saying goodbye to some dream she had never fully acknowledged. The truth was that over the weeks of living and working beside Samuel, she had begun to develop feelings that went far beyond gratitude or professional respect. She had found herself watching him when he thought she wasn't looking, treasuring the rare moments when he smiled, feeling a warm glow of pride when he complimented her work or sought her opinion on some matter. She had been falling in love with him, slowly and quietly, and without any expectation that her feelings might be returned. His proposal, practical and sensible as it was, felt like a door closing on the possibility of something deeper and more meaningful between them. But she was a practical woman, and she knew that half a loaf was better than none. A marriage of convenience to a man she respected and cared for was infinitely preferable to the alternatives that awaited her in the world below. The week that followed was strange and dreamlike, as if Virginia were watching someone else's life unfold before her eyes. Samuel rode down to the valley to make arrangements with the circuit preacher and to purchase supplies they would need for the winter ahead. He returned with news that the marshal had indeed been asking questions in town, but that most people seemed to think Virginia had gotten what she deserved by taking up with the dangerous mountain man. "Let them think what they want," Samuel said when he reported this to her. "Their opinions don't matter up here." The preacher arrived on a Thursday morning, a thin, earnest man named Jonathan Ross, who seemed genuinely pleased to be performing a wedding ceremony in such unusual circumstances. He asked few questions and offered no judgment, simply requested that they gather what witnesses they could from among the scattered mountain residents and prepare for a simple ceremony the following day. Virginia had never imagined her wedding day would be like this. Instead of a white dress and church bells and rows of family and friends, she would be married in her best everyday dress on the porch of a log cabin, with only a handful of mountain folk as witnesses. But as she prepared for the ceremony, she found herself surprisingly at peace with the arrangement. This marriage might not be the romantic dream she had once harbored, but it was honest and real and built on a foundation of mutual respect that seemed more solid than the passionate infatuations she had witnessed among her peers. Samuel had surprised her by producing a simple gold band, explaining that he had purchased it during his trip to town. It was not elaborate or expensive, but it was well made and beautiful in its simplicity, and Virginia found herself unexpectedly moved by the gesture. The ceremony itself was brief and straightforward, the preacher's words carrying the weight of tradition and law that would transform their practical arrangement into something recognized and protected by society. When Samuel placed the ring on her finger and spoke the traditional vows, Virginia felt a strange sense of completion, as if some part of her that had been floating free had finally found its anchor. Their wedding night was awkward in the way that such arrangements inevitably are. Two people trying to navigate the sudden change in their relationship status without any of the usual emotional preparation. Samuel had prepared the small back room for her continued use, making it clear that he expected nothing from her that she was not ready to give. They sat by the fire as they had so many evenings before, but now there was a new tension between them, an awareness of possibilities that had not existed the day before. "Are you sorry?" Samuel asked as the fire burned low. Virginia considered the question carefully. "No," she said finally. "Are you?" "No," he replied, and she thought she heard a note of surprise in his voice, as if he had not expected to be able to answer so honestly. As summer progressed into autumn, their marriage settled into a rhythm that was comfortable if not passionate. They worked together with increasing efficiency, their different skills and perspectives combining to create a household that ran more smoothly than either could have managed alone. Samuel continued to treat Virginia with the same respect and consideration he had shown before their wedding, but there was a new ease between them, a sense of permanence that made their partnership feel more solid and secure. Virginia found herself growing into her role as mistress of the mountain cabin with surprising confidence. She had always been capable, but the constant criticism and judgment she had faced in town had made her doubt her own abilities. Here, with Samuel's quiet support and encouragement, she discovered reserves of strength and competence she had never known she possessed. The first test of their new arrangement came in October, when an early blizzard trapped them in the cabin for nearly a week. Virginia had worried that being confined in such close quarters might strain their still developing relationship, but instead she found the forced intimacy surprisingly comfortable. They read to each other in the evenings, played chess by lamplight, and talked about subjects ranging from philosophy to practical matters of mountain survival. It was during one of these conversations that Samuel first spoke of his plans for expanding their small homestead, his ideas for improving the garden, and perhaps adding some livestock come spring. The casual way he included her in these future plans, assuming her presence and seeking her input, made Virginia realize that somewhere along the way, this arrangement had become more than just a marriage of convenience. They were building something together, creating a shared vision of the life they wanted to live. Winter arrived in earnest in November, transforming their mountain world into a landscape of breathtaking beauty and deadly danger. The snow fell in quantities that would have seemed impossible to Virginia's town-bred experience, piling up against the cabin walls and turning the forest into a maze of white corridors and hidden hazards. But inside their snug cabin, with a good fire burning and plenty of food stored away, Virginia felt safer and more content than she had ever been in her life. It was during the long winter evenings that she began to notice changes in Samuel's behavior toward her, subtle shifts that suggested his feelings might be evolving beyond the practical partnership they had originally agreed upon. He began seeking her company more deliberately, lingering over their evening conversations and seeming reluctant to retire to his own room. His touches, when helping her with some task or passing her something at the table, lasted a fraction longer than strictly necessary. Most tellingly, she sometimes caught him watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it made her breath catch in her throat. Virginia found herself responding to these subtle overtures with a growing warmth that both thrilled and terrified her. She had entered this marriage expecting nothing more than security and companionship, but now she found herself hoping for something deeper, something that might transform their practical arrangement into the kind of love she had once dreamed of. The turning point came during a fierce January storm that lasted for 3 days and nights. The wind howling around the cabin with such fury that it seemed determined to tear their small sanctuary apart. On the second night, Virginia woke to find Samuel standing at the window of the main room, silhouetted against the pale reflection of snow and moonlight, his shoulders tense with some inner struggle. "Samuel," she said softly, not wanting to startle him, "is everything all right?" He turned toward her, and in the dim light she could see something in his expression that made her heart race. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I keep thinking about what could have happened to you if you hadn't come here, if I hadn't been able to protect you." Virginia moved closer, drawn by the vulnerability in his voice. "But I did come here. You did protect me. I'm safe." "Are you?" Samuel asked, and there was something almost desperate in the question. "Are you truly safe, or have I just trapped you in a different kind of prison? You could have had a real marriage, with someone who could love you the way you deserve to be loved." The words hung between them like a confession, and Virginia felt her heart begin to pound as she realized what he was really saying. "Samuel," she said carefully, "what makes you think you can't love me that way?" He stared at her for a long moment, his pale eyes searching her face as if trying to read her thoughts. "Because I already do," he said finally, the words coming out in a rush as if he could no longer hold them back. "I've been falling in love with you since the day you walked up that mountain trail, and I convinced myself that offering you a practical marriage was the honorable thing to do. But living with you, watching you bloom and grow strong, sharing these quiet evenings and morning conversations, I realize I've been a fool. I love you, Virginia, and I'm terrified that I've locked us both into an arrangement that will prevent us from ever having something real." Virginia felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Oh, Samuel," she whispered, moving closer until she was standing directly in front of him. "Don't you realize that I love you too? That I've been hoping and praying that what we have might grow into something more?" The relief that flooded Samuel's face was beautiful to see, transforming his weathered features with a joy that made him look years younger. "Truly?" he asked, reaching out to cup her face in his hands. "Truly," Virginia confirmed, leaning into his touch. "I've never been happier than I am here with you. This place, this life we've built together, it's everything I never dared to dream of." Samuel's kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if he were afraid she might pull away. But Virginia responded with all the pent-up longing of the past months, and soon they were holding each other with the desperate intensity of two people who had found something precious they had thought was lost forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly, to give you the romance you deserve." Virginia laughed softly, a sound full of love and contentment. "Samuel Morgan, you've been courting me for months without even realizing it. Every kindness, every moment of patience, every time you've treated me as your equal and partner, that's been courtship. I don't need flowers and poetry. I need exactly what you've already given me: respect, protection, and the freedom to be myself." From that night forward, their marriage transformed into something neither of them had expected when they first spoke their vows. The practical partnership remained, but now it was infused with a love that made even the most mundane tasks feel like celebrations. They were no longer two people sharing space and responsibilities, but true partners in every sense of the word, building a life together that was richer and more fulfilling than either had imagined possible. Spring arrived early that year, the snow melting in rushing torrents that filled the mountain streams with music and brought the first green shoots pushing up through the dark earth of their garden. Virginia threw herself into the work of planting and planning with renewed energy, her happiness evident in every movement and expression. Samuel watched her with undisguised adoration, marveling at the transformation from the desperate, frightened woman who had climbed his mountain trail to the confident, radiant woman who now shared his name and his dreams. But their newfound happiness was not destined to remain undisturbed. In late May, as Virginia was working in the garden and Samuel was repairing the roof of their small barn, the sound of multiple horses approaching through the forest brought them both to immediate alertness. Virginia's blood ran cold as she recognized the marshal who had visited them the previous summer, but this time he was not alone. 3 other men rode with him, all armed and all wearing the hard expressions of men prepared for violence. Samuel climbed down from the roof with deliberate calm, but Virginia could see the tension in every line of his body as he moved to place himself between her and the approaching riders. She rose from her work in the garden, brushing the dirt from her hands, and walked to stand beside her husband, drawing strength from his presence even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. The marshal dismounted with the same stiff movements Virginia remembered from his previous visit, but this time his hand rested openly on the butt of his gun, and his companions remained mounted in a clear show of force. "Samuel Morgan," he said without preamble, "I have a federal warrant for the arrest of Virginia Reyes on charges of theft in violation of family authority." "Her name is Virginia Morgan now," Samuel replied quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made the horses shift nervously. "She's my wife, legally married and under my protection." The marshal's smile was cold and triumphant. "Marriage to a wanted fugitive doesn't make the charges disappear. I'm here to take her back to face justice." Virginia felt the world begin to spin around her as the implications of the marshal's words sank in. All their happiness, all the love they had found together, all the dreams they had built for their future, suddenly seemed as fragile as morning frost before the sun. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she felt Samuel's hand find hers, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of solidarity that steadied her racing heart. "What evidence do you have of these supposed crimes?" Samuel asked, his tone deceptively conversational. The marshal produced a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Sworn statement from her stepfather detailing the money and valuables she stole when she ran away. Witness testimony from neighbors who saw her acting suspicious in the days before she disappeared. That's more than enough to justify bringing her in." Virginia knew that the charges were fabricated, that her stepfather had manufactured evidence to support his claim and probably bribed the neighbors to provide false testimony. But she also knew that in a legal system that heavily favored men over women, her word would carry little weight against such apparently substantial evidence. "She's not going anywhere," Samuel said, and there was something in his voice that made all 4 men tense visibly. "I don't care what papers you're carrying or what lies you're peddling. Virginia stays here." The marshal's hand moved closer to his gun. "You're obstructing justice, Morgan. That's a federal crime. Stand aside or we'll go through you." "You're welcome to try," Samuel replied, and Virginia saw him shift slightly, his body settling into a stance she recognized as preparation for violence. "But I should warn you that I've killed better men than you for lesser reasons." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, 4 armed men facing one, the mountain silence broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the nervous stamping of horses. Virginia realized with crystal clarity that Samuel was prepared to die for her, to stand against impossible odds rather than let her be taken away. The knowledge filled her with such overwhelming love that it almost brought her to her knees, but it also filled her with terror at the thought of losing him to her battles. "Samuel, no," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "I won't let you die for me." He turned to look at her. his pale blue eyes blazing with fierce determination. "And I won't let them take you. We face this together, whatever comes." It was then that Virginia heard it, the sound of more horses approaching through the forest, moving fast and with purpose. The marshal and his men heard it too, their heads turning toward the sound with expressions of confusion and growing alarm. Through the trees came a group of riders, 7 or 8 men that Virginia recognized as neighbors from the scattered homesteads throughout the mountains, all armed and all wearing expressions of grim determination. The lead rider was Christopher Johnson, a grizzled old trapper who lived about 10 miles to the north and who had been one of the witnesses at their wedding. He rode straight up to the marshal, his ancient rifle cradled casually across his saddle horn, and fixed the lawman with a stare that could have melted steel. "Problem here, Sam?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had survived 40 years in the wilderness. "Nothing I can't handle, Chris," Samuel replied, but Virginia could hear the relief in his voice at the arrival of unexpected allies. Christopher's gaze shifted to the marshal, taking in the federal badge and the warrant still clutched in the man's hand. "Heard you were up here harassing our neighbors," he said conversationally. "Figured we'd ride over and see what all the fuss was about." The marshal looked around at the circle of mountain men who had quietly surrounded his small party, and Virginia could see him reassessing his situation. These were not town-bred farmers or shopkeepers who could be intimidated by federal authority. These were men who lived by their own code in a place where the law was whatever they decided to make it. And they had clearly decided that Samuel and Virginia were under their protection. "This is a federal matter," the marshal said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "I have legal authority here." "Maybe you do in town," Christopher replied with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But you're not in town now, are you? You're in our mountains, and up here, we take care of our own." Another of the mountain men, a younger man Virginia recognized as Gregory Brown, spoke up from his position behind the marshal's party. "Seems to me like you boys might have taken a wrong turn somewhere. These trails can be mighty confusing for folks who don't know them well." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Virginia saw the marshal's companions exchange nervous glances as they realized how completely their situation had changed. They were outnumbered more than 2 to 1, surrounded by men who knew this terrain intimately, and facing the very real possibility that they might not make it back down the mountain if they pressed their case too hard. The marshal's jaw worked as he struggled with the decision before him. Virginia could see him weighing his options, press forward with his legal authority and risk a confrontation that could easily turn deadly, or retreat and admit defeat in the face of mountain justice. Finally, with visible reluctance, he folded the warrant and returned it to his pocket. "This isn't over," he said, echoing his words from the previous year. "I'll be back with more men, with federal marshals who won't be intimidated by a bunch of mountain trash." Christopher Johnson's smile widened, and there was something genuinely terrifying in the expression. "You do that, Marshal. You bring all the federal marshals you want, but I'd think real careful about it if I were you. These mountains have swallowed up plenty of men over the years, and they don't always give up their secrets." The marshal wheeled his horse around with such violence that the animal reared and nearly threw him, then spurred it toward the trail with his companions close behind. The mountain men watched them go in silence, not relaxing until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely into the distance. Christopher dismounted and walked over to where Samuel and Virginia stood, still holding hands, still processing the rapid change in their circumstances. "You folks all right?" he asked with genuine concern. "Thanks to you," Samuel replied, extending his free hand to the older man. "I won't forget this, Chris." "Don't mention it," Christopher said, clasping Samuel's hand warmly. "We look out for each other up here. That's how it's always been, how it always will be. Besides," he added with a glance at Virginia, "anyone can see that this little lady has been good for you, Sam. You're a different man than you were a year ago, and it's a change for the better." Virginia felt tears prick her eyes at the simple acceptance in the old trapper's voice. These men, whom the townspeople would dismiss as savage outcasts, had ridden to her defense without question or hesitation, accepting her as one of their own simply because Samuel had chosen her as his wife. "Will he really be back?" she asked, needing to know what they might still face. Gregory Brown, who had remained mounted, shook his head. "Not likely. Oh, he might make noise about it when he gets back to town, might even write some reports to make himself look good. But he's not fool enough to come back up here with a small army, and that's what it would take. Word of what happened here today will spread, and every man in these mountains will know to keep an eye out for federal interference. As the mountain men prepared to return to their own homesteads, Christopher pulled Samuel aside for a quiet conversation that Virginia couldn't quite hear. When they finished, the old trapper tipped his hat to her with old-world courtesy. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Morgan," he said formally. "If you ever need anything at all, you just send word. We take care of our own up here." After the men had gone, Virginia and Samuel stood together in the sudden quiet, processing everything that had happened. The garden where Virginia had been peacefully working just an hour before seemed like a scene from another lifetime, and she marveled at how quickly their world had been turned upside down and then righted again. "It's really over, isn't it?" she said finally. Samuel nodded, pulling her close against his side. "It's over. Chris told me that word has already spread through the mountains about what your stepfather tried to do. If that marshal or anyone else comes looking for you again, they'll find themselves facing every man, woman, and child in these peaks. You're safe now, Virginia. Truly safe." As they walked back toward their cabin, Virginia reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She had climbed this mountain trail nearly a year ago as a desperate, frightened woman with nowhere else to turn, expecting to find either salvation or destruction at the hands of the cruel mountain man of local legend. Instead, she had found love, acceptance, and a community of people who valued loyalty and courage over social conventions and legal technicalities. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to celebrate their victory. Samuel's arm around her shoulders was warm and strong, a constant reminder of the protection and love she had found in this remote place. As they reached their front porch, Virginia paused to look back at the trail that had brought her here, then forward at the door that led to their shared future. "Do you ever regret it?" Samuel asked softly. "Giving up the chance for a normal life in town with all the things that other women have?" Virginia considered the question seriously, thinking of the life she might have had if she had submitted to her stepfather's will, married the man he had chosen, and settled into the conventional role of a town wife. It would have been safer in some ways, certainly more socially acceptable, but it would also have been a kind of death, the slow strangulation of her spirit and dreams. "Never," she said firmly, turning to face him fully. "This life, with you, in this place, it's everything I never dared to hope for. I'm not just surviving here, Samuel. I'm thriving. I'm becoming the woman I was always meant to be." Samuel's smile was radiant, transforming his weathered features with a joy that made Virginia's heart soar. "Then we're both exactly where we belong," he said, opening the door to their cabin and gesturing for her to precede him inside. As Virginia stepped across the threshold into their warm, welcoming home, she felt a profound sense of completion, as if all the scattered pieces of her life had finally fallen into their proper places. She had taken the job no woman dared, working for the man they called cruel and heartless, and it had indeed become the brightest days of her life. Here in this mountain sanctuary, surrounded by the love of a good man and the protection of a community that valued her for who she was, rather than who society said she should be, Virginia had found not just safety and security, but the deepest happiness she had ever known. The future stretched before them like an unwritten book, full of possibilities and adventures yet to be discovered. There would be challenges ahead, certainly, and hardships to face, as there always were in mountain life, but they would face them together, as partners and equals, as husband and wife, as two souls who had found in each other the missing pieces of themselves. As Samuel closed the door behind them and drew her into his arms for a kiss that tasted of promise and forever, Virginia knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. The mountain had called to her in her darkest hour, and she had answered that call with courage and determination. In return, it had given her everything she had ever wanted, and more than she had ever dared to dream. A love that would last a lifetime, a home that was truly her own, and the freedom to be herself without apology or compromise. The wind whispered through the pines outside their windows, carrying with it the eternal song of the mountains, a melody of strength and endurance, and the quiet triumph of those brave enough to forge their own path in the wilderness. And inside their cabin, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the lamp cast its golden glow over their simple but perfect life, Virginia and Samuel Morgan settled into an evening that was like countless others they had shared, yet somehow felt like the beginning of everything.